Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. It is, what is today? It's Groundhog Day. And it will be tomorrow, too, according to the movie. Hi, I'm Jack Fowler. I'm the director of the Center for Civil Society at American Philanthropic. And today is our fourth webinar that we've done since the center launched. And it's about diving deep into the Giving Well, which is a new book we've published. And look, I could not be more happy or blessed to have as the person to discuss this important new book that we've published than my good friend David Bonson, who is a, we talk here at American Philanthropic in the center about doers, givers, and thinkers, and David is all of these wrapped into one. Now, I have cheat sheets on the wall behind my computer, so I'm gonna have to glance up every once in a while and look at stuff. I got so much about David, so let me just run through this quickly, David. Hope you don't mind. David Bonson is a bi-coastal philanthropist, which I know sounds kind of like a Southern political campaign in the 1950s. His sister was a thespian, but he is bi-coastal everything. David lives in New York and he lives in Newport Beach. Newport Beach is where he founded his business, the Bonson Group. So David's a husband. He's a dad of three. He's a son of a famous and very influential theologian. He is an author. He's working on 4 books. He's done 4 books. We're going to talk a little bit about something from his latest book. There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths. He's an economist. If you happen to get stuck on Fox Business, your clicker won't come off it, you're going to see David all the time because Varney, Payne, Lizzie McDonald, Larry Kudlow, they have him on because there's a man of wisdom and trust. David's also a teacher. You teach right at the Acton School, and you're teaching at high school today. Maybe you'll tell us more about that in a bit. Founder of the Bonson Group, pushing maybe $4 billion in wealth management, David?
All in due time. We're at $3.5 billion today.
Okay, I'm gonna round that up. And you have some podcasts. 2 with National Review, Radio Free California, that you do with Will Swaim, who is the president of the California Policy Center, on whose board you sit, and then a really interesting one called Capital Record that's almost a year old now. It's a weekly podcast, both are weekly. So we're going to go through the 8 questions in the little book on Giving Well, and it makes sense, David, that the first question, and I think it's the building block and foundation on which all questions relating to philanthropy and giving, for someone who wants to consider themselves a donor, like donor per se donor. I know we're all donors, right? The widow who gave the mite was a donor. So we can't abrogate ourselves of that responsibility. But someone that wants to take a more formal, see themselves more formally as a philanthropist, really has to ask the question of themselves, what is my philosophy of giving? So before I talk a little bit about what this book says, our book says, David, I gotta believe you have asked yourself this question, and maybe repeatedly. Maybe it's an ongoing evolution. How do you answer the question, what is my philosophy of giving?
Well, you're right. I have asked myself the question, and in fact, Jack, I've had to re-ask it. It's not something that I think was one and done. The thing I love about the book, and starting with this question as number 1, is I almost believe this has to be done before the other steps can or should be. When I got to a point at which I was not just an income giver, but a balance sheet giver, meaning that my capacity to be a donor had gone beyond giving a percentage of my recurring earnings, but that I also had developed a balance sheet that enabled me to give off of it escalated the responsibility of stewardship. And like most things, I'm a big fan of one having a philosophy by which they do it, and a sort of set of guiding principles. But then, unlike certain things where there's philosophical commitments that are evergreen, that kind of stand still, I think some of the tactics that one thinks about as being a donor, you need to be able to adjust over time. You do things that maybe you have a bad experience with, and it causes you to rethink what could be a better practice, a better way to go about doing things. And so for me, when I got to a point where I no longer felt the need to give to every single organization that did anything that I liked whatsoever, and instead fine-tuned my philosophy around going deeper with less organizations instead of being more shallow with more organizations, that alone was a philosophical game changer in my philanthropy.
So that's a difference between you can give to a lot of, and we're going to talk about this. This is one of the questions later on. I mean, giving, and no knock on any of the organizations I might name, like $500 to Special Olympics and $500 to the Boys Club. I assume that for most donors, those are the sort of things that continue on, but that don't require, as you explore, like, what is my philosophy? That is about something about deeper. I want to, how do I become more effective? How do I give well in that kind of a way? I want to tell you about, for those who haven't read the book or haven't gotten the book, in the chat, there will be links to it. And I know a person, I'm helping someone out with a burgeoning philanthropy, and it's not something to gloss over. What is my philosophy? You can't wing it, and it really does require some self-exploration. But I think the book gives first of all, it concludes refine your values, as you just said, but also try this little test, self-test. And here's what our book says. Consider the causes or organizations you would support and what exactly they aim to accomplish. Then ask yourself, so what? Or why do I care? Your answers to these questions tells a lot about what's fundamentally important to you. And that's how to give well, right, David? I mean, it's to know what's important to you as you become a charitable person.
Yeah, I think that the burden is so difficult in some of the steps beyond that when you get down to then doing due diligence on what organizations meet your value system, what's the best way you can actually leverage your time and treasure to have an impact. You get into the tactics of all these things that if you start off on the wrong foot by not even necessarily really knowing what you care about most, what animates you most, philanthropy for philanthropy's sake, I think, is generally very unimpactful. Right. The notion of just sort of feeling better about oneself, getting some money off, achieving a certain tax deduction, but not having that buy-in, when philanthropy can be very targeted and focused to a philosophical core of those things that most animate us, where our passions are strongest, where we carry the biggest burden to want to see change, to make a difference, then I think it really enables a much more intelligent and targeted philanthropy into the future.
For curiosity's sake, this book was the product of a very intensive and broad survey done by American Philanthropic last year of people involved in foundations, nonprofits, giving, grant making. And just so you know what are the more important issues, here's a question that was asked: what are the top 3 issues charitable giving should be helping to advance right now? And those were alleviation of poverty, faith and evangelism, school reform, civic education, and tied for number 5, entrepreneurial freedom and free speech. There are 20 issues. The number 20 are unions. And actually, it was kind of interesting. Animal welfare and veterans affairs, both things which you see a lot of commercials about, ranked very low. Not that they're not important, but anyway, that's for curiosity's sake. David, our second question, and after this, I want to talk to you about a significant experience you had. The second question in the book is, how do I find nonprofits that share my values? And 2 things that we conclude in the book, again, this is gleaned from the study also, is that an obsession with metrics and measurable things, which some people have, and some causes lend themselves to measuring more than others, but that whole business mindset of return on investment is not necessarily a clean fit with charity, and that the most important thing is relational. How do you find nonprofits that share my values? That's about relationships. Actually, I'd like to tell a little story, and then we'll tell a secondary story about the school. Like you and I, obviously we're friends and we know each other. And you wrote me a long time ago, interested in National Review, and I don't know what, I think the stock market crashed. Maybe that's what went awry at the time. But then several years later, you reached out again and we got together. You were interested, you were a fan of National Review. And for folks watching, I used to be the publisher of National Review. And you engaged and you were generous. And then as you engaged more and became more involved, and it was a two-way street, not only that we were interested in you being supportive, but when you have these kind of relationships, the institution wants to bring that smart, wise person in more to become more involved. And you became more involved in many ways, actually, a regular writer, and as we mentioned before, a podcaster for National Review. So I from the perspective of anyone running an entity seeking support, I'd say, yeah, relationships matter deeply. I assume that's not only was your experience with National Review, but your experience with many of the institutions that you support on a significant level.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. The relational example you give of us getting to know each other with National Review is a great one. There, sometimes donors are human beings most of the time, and that you can start off with a real desire to put a check in an institution's pocket to help the cause you believe in, but you can come out of it with friendships, with action items, with priorities of things you want to devote time to. It can lead to all sorts of different things that I think expand just the traditional and limited definition of a financial donor.
Right.
And so to me, when one has the capacity to be a substantial donor, all the more so they are likely to want to be looking for something more holistic in the experience, meaning how they can give of themselves even beyond just their checkbook. And I think that the causes that we care about, when you find an organization that can help be useful in that cause, it generally means there's going to be other people that you're going to meet that share the same passion. If they're engaged and employed by or volunteering for the same type of cause, it likely means that there's the opportunity to build more connections, more relationships that can add to the quality of our lives, add to those social dynamics,
Right.
but just build relationship and depth for the future.
Yeah, I have to. We'll move on from this, but forming a relationship with you personally and then institutionally, and you and others, continues to be, and I'm a contributing editor for National Review. I still love National Review, but it's been its ongoing salvation. I think that probably is the case for many. Of course, it has to be the case for many organizations. David, again, later on, one of the questions has to do with locality and local versus global. But I'd like to give you the chance here to talk about a particular project of great passion. You understood your philosophy of giving, and it meant a lot to you to create something new and consequential. And it took not only your money, but it took your wisdom and your time. And I bring it up because it's a great little story, but also, again, someone I'm helping has this thought of being lobbied to start a new school. And it's very alluring to have people approach you in that way. They must think, you're a font of wisdom, and maybe you are. But geez, proximity, passion, roll up your sleeves, blood, sweat, tears, these things all go into it. So tell us about Pacifica Christian High School.
So Pacifica Christian has definitely been my baby as a donor, my passion project. that really has impacted my life tremendously. And it is the primary source of my donor dollars now for, let's see here, over 8 years. And yet also I'm a founding trustee. And this is one of those boards where it's not just sort of an annual 2-hour meeting, check the box, maybe a phone call every now and then. This is a very hands-on board. Particularly early on starting the school, we were literally starting the school. Now, since we've institutionalized to a large degree, we have a wonderful administration in place. We've hired a lot of just first-class educational administrative talent that is the day-to-day driver of the school. But my involvement with Pacifica goes far beyond being a board member. We're really there to be the visionaries, to overcome impediments, to be mentors to our administrators, particularly to our head of school, and to lay out a strategy and a vision that will make this a multi-generational institution serving high school students exclusively. It's not K through 8, it's not college. I think a lot of people have tremendous passion for the elementary school years, for preschool. Certainly there's a lot in colleges, grad school, and ungodly amount of donor dollars, sometimes literally ungodly donor dollars go into the post-high school educational experience.
Yeah.
But our passion was for 9 through 12. And it came from the simple biographical reality that there's very little in my life from K through 8 that I think programmed who I was going to be. And there's a lot of things that happened in my life after high school that were reasonably too late to change much about. I try as I will. But the most formative years of many people's lives, and this is my case personally, was high school. And I believe that both intellectually and spiritually and morally, socially, personally, emotionally, there is a kind of rite of passage that takes place in the high school years where one forms much of the way they're going to view the world, view themselves, view other human beings, and formulate the habits and beliefs that will guide them throughout their life. So we care deeply about the high school experience, and yet we really very firmly believe that there's a lot of high schools that take a different approach than the one we believe in. They are almost entirely there to be just preparatory for college. We're here to get your kid into a good college. And what happens to them in college and what kind of person they are going into college and what kind of person they'll be when they leave college, that's not our problem. We're here to get a high SAT score, a high GPA, to pad a college application so they can go in and you can brag to your friends that your kid got into a great college. And we don't care about any of that. Now, a lot of our kids are getting into outstanding colleges, and we've put kids in just a very short number of years since the school was launched already into Ivy League and Stanford and Notre Dame and other really great premier universities around the country. But the school does not exist for the purpose of getting people into college. It exists for the purpose of teaching them to think and live well and respecting them as human beings that have rational and social faculties that we want to develop morally and intellectually, and do so recognizing their dignity as a human being.
David, I think it's a tremendous achievement. And again, for folks interested, that's Pacifica Christian High School. Before I mentioned back on another question, metrics, and I just want to flash a book. I've written about this book for Philanthropy Daily. This is called The Tyranny of Metrics. And metrics have tyrannized philanthropy. Jeffrey Muller, the author, has a theory that business school philosophy has taken over many things, but has applied itself to philanthropy. So philanthropy has become very, professionalized, especially very large philanthropies. And so the third question we have here in the little book on giving well, remember, and that's what it's about, giving well, is what should I expect from nonprofits I support. And if I would say one thing to the editor of the book, it maybe should have been what shouldn't I expect? Because one of the things we argue about here and elsewhere at American Philanthropic is that there's a difference between charity and philanthropy. But there's also the overemphasis on metrics can be very harmful and put you, at cross purposes with your own mission of charity. Just want to read a little passage here, and then we can you can comment on it, David, or we can move on to the next question. But it says, as a donor, you have to be involved in the life of the grantee. You should feel free to call them to see how things are going. What you shouldn't do, again, that's relational. What you shouldn't do if you want a healthy relationship is swaddle your grantees in red tape. After all, do you want the charitable organization to be pursuing its mission, or do you want it to be filling out reports for you? David, you give a lot of money to, significant money to some places. What do you expect from a nonprofit you support? Is it relationship? I assume it's relationship in part. Is there anything more than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, let me first start with the comment on the metrics. I would argue that the same thing is true even in for-profit businesses, that where a quantitative measurement is used to replace various qualitative assessments, it's lazy and it can be very ineffective. And I think that especially in the nonprofit world, there are some things that are not tailor-made to quantitative measurements. There's an organization in Southern California called the Orange County Rescue Mission. A fellow, Jim Palmer, is one of the greatest experts in the country on homelessness and caring for the downtrodden. And they have metrics they can put out about how many people come in the program and how many have graduated, how many have found jobs, how many have gotten sober and maintained sobriety. All of those things are incredibly important. But one thing that Jim always hits home is that you cannot measure in a spreadsheet of KPIs, of these sort of key performance indicators that are quantifiable. You cannot measure the depth of relationship, of spiritual impact in someone's life. You could have 6 people get a job but be really unhappy, but have one person struggle to get a job but really find joy and peace. There's a qualitative assessment to it that is very important in world of humanitarian causes or educational causes. So I definitely believe that the experience needs to transcend mere metrics. I think the metrics are usually provided as just rank marketing materials, and not even very good ones at that. They're often kind of lazy. But when you ask what I would like to get out of a relationship, I think it does depend on the cause and organization. You can't scale relationships very easily. Varying people have different resources financially. So in theory, there could be more scaled access to capital depending on one's own bandwidth. But even that person, a very well-heeled donor, only has so many relationships and causes they can pour themselves into. And so for me, driving philanthropy around 3 major organizations where it's not just I write a check and you tell me how you did at the end of the year, but that there's a real relationship. I think I can have a relationship as a donor with 3 organizations, and I don't think I can with 10. So it's a matter of being realistic. I can write more than 3 checks, but I can only have relationship.
And you do.
And I do.
Yeah.
But when I'm writing a check to my 5th or 6th donor cause, that's not so much deep in the relational category in the way that I'd be pursuing with numbers 1 through 3. That's how I've sort of segmented this in the way I approach it.
David, question 4 in the book is, how do I find reliable resources to inform my charitable giving? And again, there are any number of professional, there are schools, you can get graduate programs in philanthropy that have websites, all sorts of guidance. There are publications, Chronicle of Philanthropy. There's Charity Navigator, GuideStar. I think, like a lot of, as we see in our society, wokeness and SGA and all this stuff marching through institutions, they clearly march through philanthropy. So I have a feeling a lot of the professional resources and guides are also feel the effect of what's happening to the rest of our culture But that said, I'm curious about, by the way, our book suggests it's families, it's friends, it's associates. That's who typically are the best sources for information when it comes to charitable giving. In your own world, David, you're a financial advisor. I've got to believe the people you advise will come to you. Some might at some point and say, Bonson, you made me a ton of money. Now I want to become a philanthropist. How do I go about getting advice on what to give to? Does anyone come to you and pose those sorts of questions and ask you for some guidance? And if they do, what do you tell them?
All the time, Jack. It happens all the time. And there's two different ways in which it happens. One is literally, how do I get started? How do I think about these things? Meaning they actually want a little direction and even formulating their own philosophy and doing a little discovery introspectively about their passions and causes. But then the second level is, hey, I know I really want to support X, but how do I get started? And then it is the due diligence process. Look, you mentioned GuideStar and Navigator and some of these, all of which I'm a paid subscriber to. I find all of them to provide valuable information, and I love reviewing 990s and so forth. My only critique is that they just simply are not comprehensive. You cannot get a thoroughly deep dive only by knowing compensation and annual receipts and how much cash is on hand and what they spend on fundraising and all that type of stuff. Those things can be important data inputs, but your prior exhortation about friends, family, and associates is true of most things in life, and it's particularly true in philanthropy, because the shared values and then shared experiences that others have give us the best information we're ever going to want. And I think that there's a sort of depth to someone else's actual experience that is better for me in informing my decision-making process than simply seeing some data inputs on a filing.
Yeah. Well, we're going to move on to question 5. And after that, I want to talk about one of the sections out of your book, There's No Free Lunch. So question 5 is something that confronts any number of people of charity, donors. Should I give locally or globally? And locally means local versus national versus international. Your own experience at Pacifica, I think, shows you can be truly, maybe you can only be truly consequential as an individual philanthropist if it's truly local, or you have the ability to have this kind of true relationship and interaction with the institution, the people that run it. That doesn't mean that a program to relieve hunger in the Sudan is not unimportant, does not somehow require some support. But here I'd like to pose a question to David Bonson, the economist. With the road to hell being paved by good intentions, cannot global philanthropy, maybe more so than local or national, have a truly disruptive effect, unintended consequence when done at a big scale, as do the Gates and some of these other major foundations? I mean, is giving globally problematic?
Okay, well, it's a very complicated question, and I hope my answer provides some clarity, but I suspect it's not going to. My own view is that I am substantially informed in my theology and in my politics by the concept of localism, the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity, right, the founding fathers' notion of federalism, there being a strong localism that serves as the centerpiece of government.
Civil society, yeah.
I believe that civil society done locally represents the greatest opportunity for effectiveness, for skin in the game, for accountability, but also for satisfaction and fulfillment. I also believe in the doctrine of moral proximity, that we are most morally culpable for the things that are most proximate to us.
Right.
And there is some things at a very diminished level of effectiveness I can do to aid in hunger in Sudan. But if I have a person sitting right in front of me in a crisis situation, I have the greatest moral urgency with the person sitting right in front of me versus the scenario across the globe. But
Right.
what is immediately on the table, once one reasons the way I just reasoned, is that if everybody thought that way and nobody lived in Sudan, then there would be no charitable endeavors or philanthropic pursuits for folks across the globe. And that is not my belief. I do think there ought to be organizations that are meeting the needs of those that are not immediately proximate. But I think it has to come from one who has that burden and vision and passion to then be locally involved in some of these other parts of the world that require a humanitarian response. So my personal answer is that I feel the model I care about for high school students, I don't have apathy for high school students in Abilene, Texas. I just don't live in Abilene, Texas. I don't own real estate in Abilene, Texas. I don't know the city council in Abilene, Texas. I lived in Newport Beach. I grew up in Orange County, California. So we planted Pacifica Christian because I had a heart for this local community. And I think that idea of where one's immediate investment, meaning time and heart, is, that they bring their financial investment to where their time and heart investment. There's often nostalgia. There's often family connections, generational, things that tie it together. That I would squarely be on the side of local versus global in that sense. However, that is not a belief that global philanthropy is worthless. It is simply the belief that it ought to be driven by someone who has a passion for providing very strong local presence to global charitable endeavors.
Again, we are talking today about I hope I'm showing this right, the little book on giving well, 8 questions every donor should ask. And that's not just, in our opinion, someone who's thinking of becoming a donor in a formal sense, but current donors who may find that they're a little scattershot. I think beginning with the basics and review as this book does. Question 1, what's my mission? These things need to be rethought constantly. And this book, I think, is providing excellent guidance. So David, this is not a question, but this is a terrific, your new book, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths, which I'd like to admit or say, or you said it, that whatever proceeds, what happens to any proceeds that come from this book?
100% of those donations, those royalties that I receive, I'm donating to the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Terrific place, founded by Father Robert Sirico, just the best guy. So this book, the 250 economic truths on all kinds of things. Well, there's one section early on in the book, it's the human flourishing section. And I just have to read this. It's a quote from George Gilder. And George, who was one of you guests from one of the initial Capitol Record podcasts, terrific. He's been one of the more influential American thinkers of the last 50 years. Kind of hard to think who might have had more consequence than George. Anyway, I'd just like to read this little passage he wrote, and any thoughts you might have on it. So fascinating, so basic, but fascinating. Most of America's leading entrepreneurs are bound to the masts of their fortunes. They are allowed to keep their wealth only as long as they invest it in others. In a real sense, they can keep only what they give away. It has been given to others in the form of investments. It is embodied in a vast web of enterprises that retains its worth only through constant work and sacrifice. Capitalism is a system that begins not with taking, but with giving to others. Maybe charity and capitalism seem to be first cousins, maybe even twin brothers or siblings. I think it's a fascinating, George, his perspective here. And the reason I'd like to hear your quick thoughts on that, or anything else you think in this book is worth reflecting on. David, I've had this experience. I'm sure you have. Student in college, friend of a family member, whatever, they come, oh, how you doing? Fine, fine. What are you studying? Well, this or that. Good. So what do you want to do when you graduate? Well, I want to work for a nonprofit. Like, oh, really? What nonprofit? Well, I want to work for a nonprofit. I said, oh, I always think, I never say anything because I don't want to trigger them, but ain't no nonprofits unless there are people working for profit. So anyway, any thoughts on this passage, or is there anything else in this book that you think is particularly worth knowing in light of what we're talking about today, giving well?
Well, look, the premise of my book on economics is foundational to what everyone needs to understand about philanthropy as well. And my premise that I refer to is that economics is the study of human action. And humans act around the allocation of scarce resources. They act as humans created with dignity, that were made in the image of God, were made with very particular faculties, that they are rational, that they have a certain capacity for self-interest, that they have a both moral dimension and an intellectual dimension that makes them superior to the animal kingdom. There is a lot of belief about the human person that drives what I believe about economics. And all of those things are very present in what I believe about philanthropy. When one gives to an organization, and we call it a nonprofit organization, which is really a tax term, it is run by people. Those people have incentives. Those people have abilities. They have weaknesses. They have strengths. There is an inseparable reality of the human person from all of our endeavors, whether they are entrepreneurial or philanthropic. So you're exactly right that not only is there a sort of mathematical relationship between the for-profit community that must generate wealth abundance to then fund the nonprofit community, but the other connection that is inseparable is that they are all driven by humans acting under certain incentives, certain motivations, certain talents. And I think that the same way one would think about a business endeavor as connected to a human person, they have to think about their philanthropic endeavors as connected to a human person. And what Gilder's talking about in that quote, and the sort of nature of the human person who is uniquely gifted as an entrepreneur and has this constant reality of reinvesting their ideas, let alone their time and treasure, into the people that they serve with, there's profound implications for that in the way we view the quote unquote nonprofit sector as well.
This book's been well received, in your opinion?
It's been very well received. I'm humbly grateful at how well it's been received so far, and we hope it has a long shelf life in front of it, because the principles are not meant to be applicable just to the first quarter of 2022. We think these things will matter for years and years to come.
Yeah. Speaking of books, the little book on giving well, question 6, we're going to move on. And the question is, should I give general operations donations or project-specific donations? Little passage here in this chapter. This question boils down to a matter of trust. Whether or not you trust the organization enough to cede control of how your gift is spent. And the best way to build that trust is by getting to know the leadership. I think, David, one of the things we come across, and mentioned it earlier, and it has to again do with metrics, that these organizations, they let's accept that they need to exist. They're performing, addressing a worthwhile cause. There's a significant number, certainly not a majority, but a significant number of people who think, well, that's fine and good and dandy, but the money I give wants to be for new projects and big projects, et cetera. I have a feeling that's probably a bias more of as larger institutions get larger endowments, they have much more of a staff that become much more professionalized and into that sort of measurable stuff. Anyway, how do you operate unless you have support for general operations? What are your thoughts on general operations versus project specific? Because I think you do both, and maybe you have to do both at a certain point.
Well, that's right. And as much as I felt, look, I happen to been the donor who just funded the rebuild of our athletic locker rooms at Pacifica because I love basketball and I wanted our basketball teams to have better facilities. It was a project specific purpose that we weren't going to fund from the general fund. And so I came in and funded that because I love that and have a special care for it. But if I only restricted my giving with the school to things like that, and all of a sudden we're not meeting payroll and paying the phone bill and the ongoing operations of the school, there wouldn't be a school to have an athletic program. And so I really don't know that it can be improved upon the way you guys have written about it in this book, that it comes down to trust. I absolutely sympathize with the impulse for a donor that says, look, let someone else cover the phone bill. I want my check to go to something really special. And yet I believe the phone bill has to be paid before anything special is going to be going on. And so to get to a point where one feels that their dollars are being leveraged effectively, even in a general fund or an operating fund or an annual fund, it comes down to trust with the organization. For me personally, it is true that I can rationalize that and be more comfortable with it in smaller organizations where my giving means more to the organization.
Right.
So they're making up a number, but if someone's going to be giving $10,000 and the company and the organization brings in 50 million a year, it may be hard for them to feel that their donation in a general fund is particularly useful. However, that 10,000 in another organization that lives off of 300,000 a year, it could be a much more impactful thing. So there's, again, a kind of size component that might very well be a part of the localism we talked about earlier. But nevertheless, I think that there's a both and that you have to have general funds being funded while at the same time looking for special projects that especially animate people.
Well, you've also been in the position of a fundraiser, right? I mean, when you just
Sure.
with Pacifica, I mean, you had to be in the position to ask people to support the general project, as opposed to
that's right. And then it was almost sort of self-serving because the more I could raise, the less I had to fund myself at some point. You have to democratize the fundraising because we talk about markets being scarce resources. At some point there's constraints to what people have available in their own capital. And so for organizations that one really cares about, we all become fundraisers to a certain degree as well. Because if you care about the organization enough to write a check to it yourself, you probably care about it enough to share with others in your network about the organization.
David, for our participants and folks who are going to see this later, from the study, the donor survey study that is the backbone of this book, some interesting data. Question asked, how important is it for donors to make gifts that are, and then ... unrestricted general operating? And 58% of folks said that was important. How important based on organizational leadership, personnel, mission? 30%. How important restricted program gifts? That was 25%. And then based on charitable impact and outcome metrics, 22%. Again, I think obsession with metrics is an issue, but it doesn't mean that there are not reasons for it. I gave $1 million to the college for 10 scholarships, and I'd like to make sure there are 10 scholarships. There are some things that numbers could be applied to.
But Jack, you bring up a point though, if you don't mind me hijacking this. That example is a good one because for me, giving a large amount to a educational institution that has a building, and you could say, well, I gave it for this building to get built, and now the building's built. And maybe someone wanted their name on the top of the building, and they can say my name's on the top of the building. But ultimately, I like to think most serious donors who are ideological and philosophical, they care about what's happening inside of the building. And that is the part that gets lost in the metrics. is the quality of education, the purity to the actual mission of the organization, some sort of fidelity to a value system over time. Those are the components that I think are more qualitative and harder to measure, that I would argue trump the quantifiable.
Yeah. David, before we close on the last two questions, you and I, we have to admit, we have to come clean. We're conservatives. And a bugaboo I've had for the longest time, we've discussed in various ways, are conservatives who just are compelled to make significant donations to their alma maters for whatever reason. They had a great time, at the homecoming game, long time. They met their spouse there, whatever. Do you come across that at all? Do folks? I shouldn't ask you how you advise your clients, but I find it really incredible that a lot of conservative money bankrolls institutions that are going to train grandchildren to become, communists down the line. Any thoughts on conservative giving in that realm?
Well, look, Jack, I have very strong opinions about it. I come across it all the time. I myself, from a football standpoint, have had a tremendously strong relationship with the football program of the USC Trojans in Southern California, where my father did his doctorate work.
I've heard of them.
And yet I'm disgusted by much of what might be taking place in a lot of the classrooms. And that's just not true of USC, but virtually all undergrad and grad programs today. It's very rare to find one, a school that you would say is checking all the boxes for the things that one may care about. And I think that's probably going to be true even to people who aren't, strong political conservatives. There's just certain things out there that are really problematic culturally, and yet people continue to write very big checks. And my argument against it is that there will not be change until it stops.
Yeah.
That when those donors do stop writing their checks, but in the meantime, the university bureaucrats, the professors, the diversity officers, the cultural Marxists, the whatever the ecosystem of ne'er-do-wells is, they all have one thing in common. They don't believe that the donors really care. They think the donors are fine with what's going on, and they have no reason not to believe that until the donors start proving otherwise.
Yeah. I'm not asking you to sing the praises of an institution whose board you're on, but that's King's College in New York. And I just want to say again, I'm not at National Review anymore. But while I was there, and King's College is in New York City, is where National Review is located. We must have had about 10 graduates work at National Review in one way or another. And students from Thomas Aquinas College in Hillsdale, always terrific, just always exceptional. I know King's College has its challenges, as does any institution now in New York City, but I want to sing its praises, even though you're on the board. I'm very, very fond of the institution. David, we discussed already about supporting a few organizations versus many, and you stated yourself, it is a question of capacity. You're a guy that, I know you get 2 hours sleep a night, so you do a lot more than most people. But even if the day comes that you retire, whatever that might be, you sleep 3 hours a night. There really is a limit to how involved you can be on that relational level with another institution. If there's anything more you want to say about that, if not, we'll move on to our final.
No, I just think that for me, and the number may be different for others, some may only have the capacity to pour deeply into one organization. Some may have the free time to go into 5 or 6. For me, I found the magic number was 3, and that was with one that was at like a very, very high level, and 2 that are at a little bit less of a level, but still relational. But it took a lot of knob turning and trial and error to get to that point where I thought it was the right mix for me, where I could be investing in organizations I cared about, but also maximizing my time and treasure.
Now, David, before we move on to the final question from the little book on giving well, I have 2 questions. Do you know where I'm going to be on April 6th? That's where you say, no, Jack, where are you going to be on April 6th?
Jack, I don't. Will you tell me where you're going to be on April 6th?
I'm going to be in Winter Park, Florida,
Really?
and that is the second conference the Center for Civil Society is holding. It's on democracy and philanthropy in America. And David, here's the second question, and this you're not going to get it wrong. You may have a different name, but if you could hear one United States senator talk about, I don't know, dynamism and philanthropy and civil society, et cetera, thoughtful person, who do you think that person might be?
Well, I would say Senator Ben Sass, but I don't know who you're going to say.
You're correct.
Oh, is that right?
You're all right. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Guess who's speaking at our conference on
Ben Sass is going to be at your April 6th conference. Look at that.
Yeah, I think it's terrific. So, hey, in the show notes, there'll be, or the chat and elsewhere, we'll send out to folks a link to the conference, but we hope folks will look into it. So, David, the final question in the book is, how do I protect my mission as a donor, and why does it matter? And this gets into that debate on perpetuity. We had the second webinar we did in this series, we had Heather Higgins, John Miller, and Dick DeVos talk about that. But having your great-grandchild oversee the Bonson endowment, which has become so huge over the decades, versus sunsetting it. Not that you have I don't even know, I've never asked you about that. But where do you come down on the perpetuity sunsetting debate? Because, hey, it's, in one sense, I think it's God's money, but the person that made the money might say it's my money and I'll do with it as I want. If I want it to be around 100 years from now, it's my business. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I have a nuanced answer on this subject, because what I believe is best practice is different than what I believe the regulatory apparatus ought to be. And so as a matter of best practice, I would have a bias against perpetuity in charitable instruments, that I believe that there ought to be money deployment sooner than later out of people's foundations, charitable trust, donor advised funds. But as far as a government regulatory environment to make that happen, I would default to my view that they're a disinterested third party who doesn't need to have an opinion on this issue at all. So ultimately, my reasons are pragmatic, that I think you're more susceptible to mission creep, even within your own blood lineage, as the more time goes by. And it isn't like, see, time value of money is a very complicated idea, but with charity, it isn't like we say, I want this money to last over 100 years because I need there to be enough time to unfold so there will be causes I care about out there. Well, the reason why sometimes you want to leave money to your great grandkids over multiple generations is because there's still going to be a financial need for them. You still care about children, grandchildren, great grandchildren. But with charity, the need is abundant, and I would argue reasonably infinite right now.
Present, right.
In the present sense. And so I'm all for having some degree of time and space to allow for pragmatics, to allow for a certain strategic deployment. But I do think perpetual instruments invite more risk than reward and are wholly unnecessary when weighed against the charitable needs that exist in the present tense.
David, a few closing things. One, it's davidbonson.com is one of your websites. That's where you'll find links to everything you write and the books you've written, podcasts, etc. The Bonson Group is your company. At David Bonson is your Twitter handle, I believe. The book, again, the most recent book, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths is out there. Bookstores, Amazon. I do want to say that the Center for Civil Society, which I'm the director of, its objective is to engage with givers, doers, and thinkers, so we can, as like this book suggests, to give well and to give correctly, to educate. There are many programs we offer that are educational. Now I'm going to read 3 of them, and they're on the wall across from me. Coming up soon on March 10th, there's an In the Trenches Masterclass on the elements of grant writing. And March 2nd to 4th, this is, so most of these things you can Zoom. With this, you have to get on a plane unless you live in Phoenix and go there. March 2nd to 4th, elements of fundraising training. It's very intensive. And if you're involved in fundraising and you haven't been to one of these things, you're going to regret not going. February 17th, Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising, candid advice to fundraisers from foundation leaders. That's free. In the Trenches, I don't think is free. The Elements of Fundraising, there's a little cost to it, but well worth it. CenterForCivilSociety.com. I write its weekly email newsletter, Civil Thoughts. You'll find that at civilthoughts.com. Encourage you to subscribe. And David has newsletters you should be subscribing to. David, I am really appreciative that you came today, shared your wisdom. You're not only of knowledge, but of great intimate experience in these areas and giving well, and you do give well. And thanks for elaborating on these important questions.
Well, thank you, Jack. I appreciate everything. Appreciate our friendship, and of course, all your kind words today.
Thank you. Thanks, folks, for participating. God bless. We'll be back soon with another webinar from the Center for Civil Society. Bye-bye.